thank you everyone for coming today to the station managers meeting for Pacifica Network Radio. Um, Today we have Dr. Beth Gazley. She's a professor in Indiana, and she specializes in nonprofit management and policy. And I just happened to come across, uh, uh, well, it was from PBS News. It was like an interview, but it was republished from The Conversation. That's a really great place to go to. I've found if you guys haven't checked that out. And she talked about Bill 9495 that would possibly target nonprofit, well, that would target nonprofits if it goes through, um, and accuse people of being supporting terrorism. So I think I'll just start by giving you the floor. I don't, if you want to give some background from what you know. I thought it was really interesting from what I read in your interview that it's connected to protesting as well, especially because it was um, brought about at the time when students were protesting for Gaza. And anyway, with that, Dr. Beth Gazley, we will also call you Beth. Thank you, and I'll let you go.
Okay, well, hi everybody, and thank you very much for including me. I'm usually talking to reporters rather to the people who are guiding reporters. So this is actually a new experience for me as well, and one I hope that we get to do again if another topic comes up I can help you with. So HR 9495 had been introduced several times in the House of Representatives, and Stephanie's right. The first timing was absolutely targeting Gaza protesters. It came back again under different procedural rules and failed, and then came back again under looser procedural rules and succeeded. Each time, it's important to mention that the party line vote at the Republican end was solid, but Democrats did support it at the beginning more than they did later. That's because the bulk of the meat of this bill is actually something that's entirely non-controversial, and that is to allow people who've been detained abroad to avoid tax penalties, that sort of thing. It's just one of those nice little things Congress does for people who get caught up abroad. And but then they put this rider, if you want to call it, in this bill to push it through as something that was non-controversial. And I think Jamie Raskin had the best quote. He called it a werewolf in sheep's clothing on the floor when he made his remarks. What it does is allows the Treasury Secretary, who of course is a political appointee, to directly revoke the tax exempt status of US domestic nonprofit corporations that he views as providing support to foreign terrorist organizations. You guys probably already know there's a very clear definition of what a foreign terrorist supporting organization is. There's not a clear definition at the federal level of what a domestic terrorist organization is, but there is a clear definition on the State Department website. And so it's already illegal for citizens to support foreign terrorist organizations. They will go to jail or get deported if they do that. And so I think one of the questions that's been raised about this is, well, what does it add? What's the value here? And the value in my mind is two things. First of all, we have a president who's not just threatening, but actually actively retaliating against political opponents. He's doing it this moment. And we also have a president who has asked for legal changes to deepen the layers of political appointees in the federal agencies. And third, we have a president who values loyalty above competency in these appointments. And so I think the first thing that we can see this is as it's a tool of the Treasury that bypasses the due process procedures the Internal Revenue Service already has in place for revoking a tax exempt status and gives it to somebody who's going to use it. That's one scenario. The other scenario is that it causes not-for-profit organizations to self-censor. And that's actually my viewpoint. I've seen a number of these laws, everything from laws that we have a public law in Indiana now that requires me to practice viewpoint diversity in my classroom. These are usually poorly written. They're usually not written by people who are paying motivated to pay close attention to details in defining, terms that they're using. And so they confuse, they distract, and they cause anxiety. And what I'm hearing from the not-for-profits out there is a lot of confusion about then what is defined as providing material support, which is not part of this law. It's not written into this law, a clear definition of material support, but there are other references in the State Department website, and you can kind of see. But the definition even of material support includes things like information. It includes some things that I don't think anybody's expecting to happen, like training and weapons training and that sort of thing. But then other sort of things like coordination or information about foreign terrorist organizations are also included in that definition. And so bringing this back to its origin in student Gaza protests, what I think it means for not-for-profit broadcasting organizations is we first have to think about university broadcasting organizations, but then I think we have to think about the nonprofit sector more broadly as often exchanging information or exchanging messages that might or might not align with the kind of messaging that's coming out of, say, Hamas. And so we don't know what the tipping point is because the law hasn't passed yet. It will go to the Senate. I think the nonprofit leaders out there, independent sector, nonprofit Congress, Council of Foundations, I think they're hoping that enough senators can hold firm on opposing this law so it doesn't go any further. But I think that's probably wishful thinking. I think this is probably going to turn into a public law in January when a new Congress reconvenes. So I've got more to say, but let me stop there and see what else is on your minds.
I just wanted to mention too that I was reading what you were talking about this morning again, and what you just said today was, people who do commit these supporting terrorists would go to jail or go, be investigated or be in real trouble. Like, it seems odd that you would just say, oh, you lose your nonprofit status and that's it. Like,
Well, there's a possibly third strategy to this. Authoritarian regimes, if you look at I'm not a political scientist, well, maybe I'm half of one. But when we study authoritarian regimes, there are real clear tools that they use, and they use them over and over again because they work. And one of them is othering the opposition. And so you guys are in the business of words and rhetoric. And I think it's probably pretty obvious to you already that political opponents of the Republican Party have been othered in many ways. And we've seen this in Atlanta with the Cop City protests, for instance, where they were all called essentially corrupt using RICO laws and also called terrorist using the state's definition of domestic terrorism. And so this othering, I think, matters in the not-for-profit context because then we have to be thinking about the way our donors and our stakeholders might be responding to language that seems to be telling us as not-for-profits that we no longer belong in the civic space. We're no longer civil society organizations. We're something that ought to be avoided and not supported.
does anyone else have thoughts so far?
Yeah, I have a question. Hi, Beth. Thanks for doing this. So I'm wondering if so nonprofit organizations belong to the states that they reside in. Technically, I mean, their legal status is with the state. How does that work with the Department of Treasury? Does
Yeah.
the Department of Treasury just supersede the state process, or is the state somehow involved with that? I mean, I know this is all hypothetical, but
Well,
what's the plan?
Well, it's so funny, Ursula, because I just got off the phone with a collaborator of mine, Jennifer Alexander. So I gave her a heads up. She's my co-author on the one of the pieces that kind of set off this my commentary in the first place. And we kind of agreed that we didn't want to necessarily feed tools of authoritarianism to the right wing. Um, so I can speculate, but I'm kind of hoping some of this doesn't come to pass. So states recognize not-for-profits as private corporations, as domestic nonprofit corporations. They grant some tax exempt status to not-for-profits at the state level, but the real tax exempt recognition comes at the federal level. So there's two things nonprofits need to be domestic nonprofits. They need a tax exemption and they need corporate status, independent status. One happens at the treasury level, one happens at the state level. What I think we can rightly worry about is when we do have trifecta states, right? Like Indiana, where we have a supermajority of the Republican Party controlling state politics, is that they could easily decide to change state law to say automatically revoke the corporate status of an organization the Treasury Secretary has yanked. Okay, now you guys understand the ACLU is all over this. There are all kinds of constitutional challenges to this sort of behavior. But the way this law is written, the HR 9495, it doesn't give not-for-profits enough time to organize their legal defense. And I can tell you, based on what's happening in Atlanta, just being indicted or accused of that kind of criminal behavior is quite disruptive to people's lives. And so that's why I think the real result of all of this is going to be self-censorship.
So if you're in a blue state where you don't necessarily have a Republican majority, is there a possible scenario where you would lose your 501c3 status, but you would keep your nonprofit status?
Exactly. You're absolutely right about that. So the other shoe that's left hanging here is, well, what are blue states going to do about this? Well, they pass new laws that allow that organization some other legal status to protect those organizations, right? So yeah, it upends it can upend the way states treat not-for-profits in numerous ways.
You're saying, but the
Revoke property
501c3.
tax exemptions, for instance, right? Retaliation at the state level includes sales tax, property tax, and legal corporate status. And each of those could be protected, or it could align with what the Treasury's being asked to do here.
Mhm.
Did I get your answer there?
Yeah, I think so. But and then the 501c3 status, that's kind of a while, that's kind of gone because that's a federal.
That's federal. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I not everybody agrees with me about this, but I think generally speaking, the Internal Revenue Service is really pretty strong on nonprofit due process rights. So they could have written this bill to say, we are going to hand these questions of foreign terrorist support to the Internal Revenue Service and direct them to investigate. But they didn't do that because the IRS is so strictly and deeply nonpartisan. That's the way it was built. And, Republicans have to pay their taxes, Democrats have to pay their taxes, right?
Let's see, is
Folks,
anyone else got a question or a comment?
This is Clay.
Hi, Clay.
I was just wondering numerous things. One that comes right off the top of my head is what about other organizations that are not necessarily considered left? Would they not be affected by these measures?
well, they could be. They could be. I mean, if this law were applied in a nonpartisan way, you could imagine, say, goodness. I mean, white supremacists are really sort of grassroots and homegrown, but some other, I don't know, a communist organization, say, that's got some sort of foreign affiliation. You could imagine these laws being applied against them. People who are observing this space, though, are not seeing that kind of even-handed application of these laws. These, the way we witnessed the Gaza protest on our campus was quite unbalanced, and our president was accused, in my viewpoint, rightly so, of viewpoint discrimination. by upholding some students' First Amendment rights and denying other students.
We're all thinking deeply here.
I can tell. There's a lot of
So,
moving parts here. A lot of
so what
moving
about
parts.
appropriations of how they fund it? You know, there's mixed messages. On one hand, they want to cut down the amount of agents to the IRS to investigate matters, but it looks like they're going to reallocate them to other kinds of jobs, or maybe, as you're pointing out, they bolster Treasury. If a budget is passed, I'm thinking it won't come into effect until 2022 because, well, I think we're going to be going on a continuing resolution possibly soon. I'm just thinking of how they fund the actual enforcement of these new
That's a great
laws.
question, Clay. And it isn't one I've thought about, but I can give you a little bit of background. And that is since well, I can expound on why this happened, but we mostly know it as the scandal the IRS created when they were viewed as singling out Tea Party supporting organizations about 10, 15 years ago now. And at the time, of course, then Congress went on a IRS retaliation for 10 years and really underfunded the Internal Revenue Service over that time. And those of us who really view the IRS as a regulatory ally for building a strong nonprofit sector, and I'm one of them. We think the IRS should have more funding. They got some back under the Biden administration, but they don't really have the budget for large scale investigation here. This isn't something that I'm expecting gets down to those layers of Treasury. I think this is something that's really meant to happen at those higher layers with political appointees. The IRS, for instance, one of their requirements in terms of the due process balance is this burden of proof process. If an organization in all other ways has fulfilled its regulatory requirements in terms of filing 990s and all the rest of it, then the burden of proof with the IRS falls on the IRS to provide evidence that this organization has violated the law. This HR 9495 is written in the opposite direction. The burden of proof falls on the not-for-profits. Initially, they have to essentially, with incomplete information on a very short time frame, it looks to me like they have to mount a legal defense. And so I'm not sure much of this does involve the IRS, to be perfectly honest.
And I have a question also.
Go ahead, Paul.
Sort of the layers to this that are confusing and concerning to me. One, if we have major donors who are scared off by this, if we're providing news information, I'm thinking of the stations that have Democracy Now! On that I would presume would fall into the list of people that this particular secretary might not want to have around. If we're providing news information that way, are we in need of planning for a defense ourselves, and are we in need of providing some sort of support to our major donors in their efforts to do that? And if we do those two things, where do we start? Do we start with the ACLU?
Well, maybe we all start our board meetings by reading the First Amendment aloud.
Yeah.
That wasn't facetious. I really mean that.
No, I agree. I see that.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, you're talking strategy, and that's up to you guys. I would be talking to donors right now and helping them understand what a free press means and what is considered to be, you know, an allowable expression of opinions versus foreign terrorist support. I mean, I think helping people understand the political game we're in the middle of here is a good starting point. So people can understand the terminology that's being used in the national media and understand also how to interpret these actions, how to put them in some better context, what's happening at the federal level.
I
Seems
mean,
like it would be good to have,
Authoritarianism.
sorry,
Oh, we
Ursula.
had to
Many
go.
tools. Oh, sorry, Stephanie,
Uh,
go ahead.
Sh- Sharon, was that you?
Yeah, thank you. Just quickly to say on what Beth just said, but it would be great if we could pull together an announcement that we could share with the Pacifica affiliates that, something short, a PSA type of thing to let people know, what's happening and again, the importance of free press. And while I have the mic, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
are big universities, like, is Indiana University concerned about this? They are nonprofit organizations, powerhouses.
Our university administration is not supportive of the student pro-Palestinian protests. That's been pretty obvious. We're one of the campuses where the state police were called in at the urging of the president. They did not want to come, and the president asked them to come, invited them on campus, put student activists under sniper scopes for an afternoon. It was weak. And so we're not going to have those kinds of statements coming from our university. We're a public university in a red state with a board of trustees that has a supermajority appointed by the governor. But I think other universities in other states, particularly those who have really gone to bat for students with sanctuary policies and other kinds of protective policies, I think they're the target here. And because so many universities, I did a little deep dive of my own just to sort of refamiliarize myself with non-commercial radio stations. Colleges and universities own 31% of all non-commercial radio licenses. So that's from the FCC. So I think there are plenty of universities out there that, but not mine, that ought to be concerned about this, Sharon.
And then to further that, probably the university stations themselves, so that if the universities are getting concerned, they might be concerned about these free microphones that the students have.
Well, one thing they're going to do is divest. Our student paper was just told to go out on its own.
Oh.
It's essentially being shut down as a university program. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Ernie Pyle studied here. It's really hitting people deep.
Wow.
Yeah. So
Jeez.
yeah, I think that is something you might worry about in the radio space.
And censorship from the administration on university press.
Well, yeah, but they can't win the censorship game, so they'll just
They'll
spin
just
off the radio
get rid of
station.
it. Yeah. There's certainly been a lot of sales of college frequencies in the past, decades. I expect that might increase if the universities become increasingly afraid of these laws.
Yeah, I think it'd be much more likely that a university is saying, well, it's no longer the mission of the university to support a public radio station. I know it would break our hearts, but I could see that happening.
Well, in the college stations too, just outright selling them because they don't want the students to have the free, because it seems like the universities might be afraid that the students could say something. Yeah.
And this is not speculation. We are seeing this on our campus. We had a Palestinian artist have an alumnus. Major retrospective exhibit was canceled. That was the museum. Okay, so now viewpoint discrimination in the arts. And then we also have the Kinsey Institute here, which was just defunded by the state government. It's a university program still, thanks to some pressure by faculty, but it's no longer receiving any public funds. So this divestment and defunding and canceling of controversial programming is happening already.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm retiring soon. Call me
Mark,
anytime, you guys. Plenty of time
Mark is
for you.
going to have a
John,
field day.
what's that, Clay?
I'm being facetious.
Oh,
Mark
okay.
Hand is going to have a field day.
Oh,
Beth,
geez, yeah.
Beth,
Public radio cabinet.
Beth, you talked about the argument to be made to funders, making the distinction between, free speech and terrorist activity. Say, and I know this is strategic, but I'm just curious what your thoughts have been on this. Say if it gets to the point where somebody is at a point where this actually does happen to them, an organization, do you foresee any sort of format or platform by which this argument can be made as a self-defense against losing one's status? I mean, is there a place where this argument can be made legally?
Oh no, it's speculation, right?
Right. I mean, what avenues do you see? Are we talking about going to the courts or what? What would be the
Well,
platform for self-defense?
I mean, I think you can see that I believe in preemptively calling this out for what it is. Frankly, I'm really surprised that we're in mid-December having a conversation that started in November. I really thought when I put that piece together with Emily Schwartz Greco at the conversation, who covers the nonprofit and philanthropy beat there. And by the way, if you aren't subscribing to the conversation, it's such a great source of information. And I really thought that was going to be a 15-minute story and everybody was going to move on. And the fact that we're still talking about this nearly a month later, tells you that there are more people out there who are thinking like me, that we really preemptively have to call this out for what it is and warn people in advance that this is a tool of authoritarianism. Call it for what it is. And even if we can't prevent it, at least we've given our donors and supporters a different context to think about laws like this.
Beth, I have a question about whether, if this passes, the Congress would expand it to include domestic terrorism, which, as you said, there's no definition. So, it could be anything. It could be criticizing the government. Do you
Yeah.
see something like this happening?
Yeah, John, first of all, let me say I'm still a learner in that space myself, but I'll tell you what I think. That is that the states are definitely on of course, states are incubators of innovation, right? And very often the federal government's looking to the states for new ideas and seeing how policies play out at the state level before adopting them at the national level. I think the area of domestic terrorism falls into that category. Most states now, if not all, have a definition of domestic terrorism. And they are using their laws and they're updating their laws to increase the criminal penalties. And they're applying their laws, like in Georgia, applying their laws. In fact, Black Lives Matter protesters in Arizona were first charged with a domestic terrorism charge back in 2020. All charges were dropped. And so there have been efforts in Congress, although I haven't followed them closely, for defining domestic terrorism at the federal level. And I definitely could see that on the agenda of a Republican-controlled Congress. I could definitely see that. And I think that's something that we all should be concerned about. The combination of domestic terrorism charges and RICO charges, to me, is a really toxic combination because it essentially turns around and uses against civil society organizations what they're already really good at, and that is organizing, right? RICO laws are about coordinated action for corrupt purposes. If you get to decide what a corrupt purpose is, all you have to do is say, well, geez, you nonprofit, you have a board, you're leading this stuff, you've got communications, phone bill, phone records and stuff, you're coordinating. And we're going to call whatever you're coordinating, if we call it illegal, the evidence that coordination happened is the easy part of the case.
Yeah.
I have a question concerning evidence from the reading that I've done. I have it in mind. My understanding is that there's no need to actually present evidence. They could just strip you of your nonprofit status just by accusing you of being a terrorist or aiding terrorism, and just strip that and not have. There's no obligation to present evidence.
There's less obligation, is my understanding, Michael, but I do not have the details on that. But again, back to what I said earlier, why do we need this when we already have an apparatus within the IRS for registering charities or other nonprofits? And I think that the fact that that area, the kind of the nature of the evidence and how much evidence is needed and when it is, the fact that that's fuzzy, again, in my viewpoint, is deliberate.
Let's see, I'm looking to see if there's any other hands up or,
I have a question.
yes, Joseph.
This is regarding native rights. It has to do with, well, you take a look at the programming that there's only 66, maybe 68 native stations, and most of them are licensed with tribes. And tribes, some tribes like the Hoopa tribe here is a self-governance tribe, so we have a direct compact with Congress. And now that a new administration is coming in with from what I understand, a person who is highly favorable to resource extraction,
Yeah.
the pipeline whole thing, and
Yep.
a lot of native stations are really going to be on top of this, what is happening. So what jeopardy are we stepping into? Because now we have a sovereign right entity, well, two sovereign right entities coming face to face on an issue, and we don't necessarily always agree with one another.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for you, Joseph, but I think those are exactly the kind of questions you should be asking right now. I can say that.
Yeah, I'm asking our tribal chairman, what are we going to do about this? Well, I'm concerned about the FCC, what actions might happen with our native stations that are, but we're under the nonprofit. We have a dual citizenship type of a situation where, yes, we're Americans, but we're also natives citizens as well. So, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of what you said earlier, Beth, about reminding ourselves what we do have to stand on in terms of free speech and rights, and going over that for ourselves.
Well, I sit here as a person of privilege, right? I'm in a protected position, semi-retired, and I think the chances that they come banging on my door are a lot lower than some other folks. But I really do think that when we have a position of privilege, the best defense is a good offense. That we really have to help other people understand what their rights are as well and protect them if we can.
And Ruth, I see you have a question or comment.
Yes, I really like the idea that you mentioned of getting donors together and just starting to have community meetings where we are explaining what's going to happen, because it's almost inevitable, right? And if you read history, it has happened before when governments want to do what they want and they have a very strong opposition, which is what we are seeing in the United States to what's being done in the United States. And that goes for, whatever sector you pick, education, housing, healthcare. Like, the people in this country are going to start basically revolting against the government. And you start seeing similar laws like that. I was already of the belief that the nonprofit status exists to silence a big chunk of our population already, because one of the main requirements is that you stay out of politics, right? And it is quite effective at silencing a large number of our communities. And now we're just going to see like the worst expansion on that. But one thing that has proven to be efficient, throughout history, is the power of organizing people. Like everything that we have won has only come from the power of the people. Everything, every single right, like even the 8-hour day came from organization. None of it has been granted. So we really need to take that approach when it comes to fighting for free press and our ability to maintain nonprofit status while we are doing what we have been doing, forever. We really need to, like, I suggest that every station that's represented here, you need to get into a coalition with local activists, with local community organizers, with other people that are like-minded, and put up a good resistance. We should not take this like laying down and let hopelessness and defeat enter our hearts and feel like there's nothing that we can do. At a minimum, we can raise hell. At the bare minimum, we can raise hell. And that's what we need to get ready to do, come this now. And basically calling it for what it is. I really like your approach, Beth, when you mentioned that. Like, this is really just so that people censure. Yes, it is. Like, just really calling it for what it is. And another thing that will be really important is once they start, I call it criminalizing organizations, right? For like the Palestinian students have been criminalized. Once that starts, it'll be very important to not buy into the narrative of, it is presented as terrorism, right? And it sounds legit. The FBI does a great job at just making these indictments sound so legit. And like, we have all of this proof, I'm thinking of the Uhuru 3 right now. And then once there is an actual process, which we know is not here, right? Because there's a lot of confusion, intentional confusion around the due process. Then the truth comes out, and then you see FBI agents like in court, or basically state that they wrote an indictment and put in these things, even though they have zero evidence to it. And the truth really comes out. But it's so important for the people themselves, for the different organizations, to not buy into the lies and to maintain that unity, right? Because now we have a united enemy, which is basically our government in a way. But just to not buy into that, because that's what creates division. If somebody tells me, oh, Sharon and, WXOZ are a terrorist, and I go buy into that, the cracking begins. The cracking in the unity that we should maintain begins. But having that strong understanding, and like you mentioned, giving that political analysis so that people truly understand the truth behind it, that is not, Sharon's actions, that is really just the censorship and the takedown of any type of resistance, anyone that stands up against this government. I do hope that something that keeps me hopeful is that wherever there is oppression, there is resistance. And it's inevitable, and it just happens naturally. Even if it is at work, you get a bad manager, people start acting differently and they start standing up. Everywhere there is oppression, there is resistance. And that's something that we will look forward here. But then once we do have the resistance, we have to join it, because the power is really in the numbers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth.
So I got a few responses, and wow, thank you very much for that. You talked about advocacy and advocacy rights, mass mobilization, and coalitions. So there's a spectrum of about 30 different kinds of tax-exempt organizations out there that are called nonprofits. C3s cannot engage in partisan political activity, although they can advocate for public laws and legislative change. C4s can be heavily engaged in partisan political activity. C5s, unions, C6, chambers of commerce, they're all partisan. They can choose to be partisan. That's not generally understood. And the advocacy restrictions of C3s, in my experience teaching many executive education classes over the years with nonprofit practitioners, my experience has been that we believe our political rights as not-for-profits are more limited than they really are. This has also been proven out by a report that I suggest you guys go look for. It's about a year old. It's called The Retreat of Influence, And you can find it on the independentsector.org webpage. It's an academic report that was done in partnership with Independent Sector. And the main finding is that nonprofit advocacy generally has really fallen off. That's the retreat part of this. Really fallen off. It's at much lower levels based compared to a benchmark study that was done about 25 years ago now. And so there are lots of not-for-profits out there already. We can see the evidence, Ruth, that they are retreating from this political space because they are concerned about advocating in a highly partisan, more divisive environment and what that might mean for donors and stakeholders, how donors might accept that or not accept it. Mass mobilization has a kind of a rocky history when it comes to coalition building. Another thing that happened on this campus when we were watching the Gaza protests was it was kind of like witnessing the reign of terror after the French Revolution, because we watched the coalitions form and then we watched them fall apart again. And you know, there were jokes about the Girondists and who was Robespierre and when were they going to come for my head and that sort of thing. This is all on Signal channels, by the way. And this was not fun stuff. I'm not making silly jokes. This was serious stuff. And so, you know, even with the women's marches that we've had the last couple of years, we've seen evidence that coalition building in this country is pretty weak, that, you know, special interests tend to carry the day when they shouldn't, right? We can all rally around the First Amendment. It's I test my undergraduates on the First Amendment, and I seriously do that because I just think that there's something in there for everybody. And given the way civics education is developing in this country, I really don't think that it's overstated to, kind of ground our stakeholders and our supporters back in our fundamental political rights. It's at least a starting point.
Beth, I have another question about that. Advocacy for the IRS allows nonprofits to do, I think it's 10% of their activities for advocacy or lobbying for political candidates, but the FCC has a total restriction
That's
for
true.
stations.
Good point. Yeah, that is true. That's a good point. Yeah. So a non-FCC, not-for-profit could, depending on the size of its budget, actually spend up to 20% of its budget on legislative advocacy. A great example of how much nonprofits do that, you could look at maybe the NCAA, right? They do a ton of lobbying to protect amateur athletics. They don't spend nearly that much. So the average is well below your figure, John. It's, I think, somewhere of those who do it, somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 2 or 3% of their budgets for the 1/3 of not-for-profits out there that have done any advocacy. And that's only lobbying. Issue advocacy is unrestricted. So it may or may not be with an FCC station, right? A licensed station. But if issue advocacy for a run-of-the-mill C3, we need a stronger protection for human rights in this country. Well, they can say that 100% of the time. If they're sitting down in front of a legislator talking about HR 9495, then there is a restriction on that. But there's no nonprofit out there that I found yet that exceeds that spending limit. They just don't even come close.
So what is the restriction on advocacy for legislative issues like
lobbying? Yeah, that's lobbying.
Lobbying, yeah. And
it's up to 20% of a C3's expenditures, depending on the budget.
And based on the IRS, it doesn't matter if there's a call to action or not. That's more of an FCC issue.
Though the lobbying definition includes a call to action, and in fact, they, I believe, no longer use, they used to have sort of a bright line test. You had to say, Senator Smith, vote on this bill. They have more of a sort of a facts and circumstances definition, which I expect the FCC does as well. So you do have to, if it's something that an organization was going to get into in a major way, they're usually talking to a lawyer to make sure that they're they're using the appropriate language.
Yeah, I think for me at least, it's confusing because it's not clear, like if saying things, making call to actions on the air, does that constitute a part of your budget, or how do you quantify that?
Yes, it would count as part of your budget. Yeah, it's, oh my gosh, we're getting into the weeds. I'm geeking out on
Yeah,
this.
I
There's an
know.
expenditure, there's two ways C3s can report this, and one of them is through an expenditure test, which is a much more clear-cut and easy to follow method. Again, like I said, most nonprofits are not using the expenditure test, but then it's only based on how much money they spend. And if they have, say, I don't know, a volunteer broadcaster making a statement, might or might not be viewed as something they spent money on. I think to be safe, you probably would view it as something that fell under the budget. But there
So
might be
you
exceptions.
quantify it with dollars, not with airtime.
Well, this is your area of expertise, not mine. So I think you guys would have to maybe look at some organizational leaders and figure out if they do this kind of work, how do they evaluate it from a budgetary point of view. Paul.
May I just ask for a little clarification among us here? 20% is, I believe, the limit to direct lobbying. I think advocacy is not included in that. And also,
Right.
nonprofits are always allowed to engage in education.
Yep.
Aside from the Middle East issues, I would, for example, borrow from my past experience with the Alliance for Community Media, which, by the way, we had both a 501c3 and then formed a 501c6. And I think there is also a C4 component so that we can engage in direct lobbying. And perhaps it's something Pacifica or some amalgamation of stations could consider pooling to. But this is an opportunity, I think, for stations that are dedicated to protecting the First Amendment to exemplify a reverence and respect for the First Amendment, use this opportunity to educate and highlight this discussion. This was brought up a little earlier by Ruth, pointing in that direction. But I think we need to be a little less apologetic about that if we're allowing certain issues to be discussed. That's the whole idea, is the free exchange of ideas. That said, in protection of, my mind goes into this other gear that, again, from the public access stations, which are recognized by the Congress, the Supreme Court, and the FCC as First Amendment forums, that it would behoove stations to proactively adopt policies internally, and perhaps, like I'm thinking of universities, for example, to make a show that you are updating policies to clarify what programming and free speech and limitations, editorial management, just in a way to help both engage them in a conversation and to give them a little more confidence, rather than coming down on you that we're the solution and we propose some possible solutions for them to stand on.
Yeah, Clay, I agree with you entirely, and that's adds another tool to the list that Ruth has already offered. That is your associations. And so we do have we have not-for-profits that affiliate, C3s affiliate with C4s. We call them related organizations. But you also probably pay dues to broadcasting associations and other associations that do your advocacy for you. That's really common in the nonprofit sector generally. So I expect it applies to you guys as well. Disabilities direct service agencies that provide disability services pay dues to ARC of organizations, and then do their Medicaid advocacy and lobbying at the state capitol. And so that's another tool you've got as well. Paul, with apologies.
Oh, Paul, you're muted.
Yeah, this is sort of a confusing question for me, but what I'm seeing in other areas in terms of what's already taking place with censorship and self-censorship is the use of the tool of not having legal standing. So the facts of a case may have some bearing, and then what the government's response has been. We don't have to pay any attention, and this is state level as well as federal. We don't have to pay any attention to that because you don't have legal standing. So I would wonder how we set this up with coalitions, where we make sure that we have handy ways of establishing ourselves in a way that gives us legal standing on anything that might come up.
I think so. Just to clarify, Paul, you're talking about the fact that you can't really preemptively challenge a law unless that law has affected you directly, right?
Yeah.
That's when you have legal standing. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah, let's pay attention to the way, if this law passes, we'll pay attention to the way it's being used. We should be having regular conversations with your state ACLU. They are very good at figuring out how to preemptively challenge these laws. They lose some of them, but they do push the legal standing side of this. They're certainly doing that in our state with some of the state laws that have passed. And so, I wouldn't say we have to wait for this, but I do think that's another piece of the evidence that this is a law that's really meant to censor preemptively.
See, anyone else have any thoughts?
I guess the last thing would be
Someone's doing the dishes.
yeah,
I see
some
Ruth.
cool music or something. Before we go, and I don't know how much time everyone has, but it seems like what would be our action items that we could take away from this conversation? What do we need to, reminding our audience about the First Amendment, reminding them, something about this law and, the language of terrorism and how that can be used against people just for using free speech. Can we tell our listeners to contact their Congress people about this law that has not actually been passed yet? I mean, is there still hope? Is there still time to advocate for that? And can we use the airwaves to do that?
You might follow the National Council of Foundations, independent sector, and some of the other major nonprofit representatives. They're mainly representing kind of the general C3 world, the philanthropy world, but they have put out joint statements. If you guys, I don't know, Stephanie, or if you've got some other way of my sending you a few links, I'd be happy to do that. And that at least would give you a little bit of the language that already is being used out there in joint statements.
That'd be great. Yeah, if you send me some, I could send them out to everyone.
Okay.
As Pacifica's National Compliance Officer, I think we have to be very careful that that our programmers are not trying to influence federal legislation. If you have a guest, the guest can say it. Anyone associated with the station should not. That's my understanding from our broadcast council.
Yeah. Thank you, John. That's a good reminder.
We've time to get to Ruth again.
Go ahead.
Who's got a hand up?
Yeah, I see Ruth, and yes.
Yes, I was just going to ask if, once it's going to affect and if there are people impacted, since Pacifica is, a big national organization and we are part of the global community, which we often forget about, is there any way that we can complain through the United Nations directly as the, looking at this as an attack on the free press?
Oh, man. Can I have a whole nother hour with you guys?
Yes. Let's reschedule right now.
Yeah, we'll talk. You know, I think it's only a matter of time, to be perfectly honest, before we're having conversations. The US is having conversations with the UN about the state of our imperfect democracy.
Okay, noted. And I saw in your conversation piece that you and your colleague are monitoring around the world other right-wing pushes and
Oh, we
people
don't
are
have that much
responding.
capacity, but we are monitoring it in the US
Okay, got
at the
you.
state level. Yeah.
Clay, you have your hand up, and I see we're getting towards the end of the hour, so we should probably wind it down, but we could take a couple more.
I just wanted to restate the suggestion about the partnering in some way with the ACLU. Again, drawing back on my public access PEG days, there was a case study of the ACLU actually sided with the KKK in not Topeka, it was Kansas City, where the city tried to lock out the KKK from broadcasting on their cable station because it's not terrestrial. The city had local rights to manage the station. At the end, the lesson learned was that it was wrong for the city to shut down because of the least of us that by protecting the least of us, we're protecting all of us. And it's sort of a standard. I don't know how many people here know that Casper Weinberger was once a broadcaster on Pacifica Radio way back in the day, for example. Just
So
from some
Clay,
food for thought.
I would put FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, up there right next to the ACLU in terms of their steadfast support for a nonpartisan First Amendment. They've really been out there in support of, Israeli student rights, that sort of thing. So if you're representing campuses or higher ed, FIRE ought to be on your radar screen too.
Repeat that name, please. I'm sorry.
FIRE.org, Foundation for
Got
Individual
it.
Rights in Education, or an expression, I think they might call themselves now. They're trying to be bigger than higher ed, and they're really great to follow. They
And
disagree
not to
with
get
the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors. They think the AAUP is too conservative on free speech rights. So they're if you want to kind of see who's really got the broadest definition and the most nonpartisan definition of human right of free speech rights, I'd go to them.
very good. Thank you.
Any last comment before we stop?
Well, Stephanie, thanks for rescheduling this so I could make the holiday party.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
we just posted grades, you guys. It's time to celebrate. But I would love to join this again if you think there's another reason to bring somebody like me in. If you're looking for someone else in some other nonprofit space, or anything, I'd be happy to look around for a referral for you as well.
Oh,
Just
that's so wonderful.
please, and feel free to reach out to me directly.
Okay, great. Well,
Yeah.
I'm grateful we could have you today, Beth. It was enlightening and your clarity was wonderful. And it's very grounding to have you with us. And thank you everyone for your contributions. And we will certainly would love to invite you back. So I'm glad I have your email. And yeah, with that, thank you so much, everyone. And have a good rest of your day and enjoy your holiday party.
So good to meet you all. Take care.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Beth.
much.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, everyone.
holidays.
Take care.
Thank you so much.